Let's look at the major events of the U.S. Civil War in the first few years of combat, years 1861 to 1863. Primarily, the Confederacy was in the lead in the beginning years of this war for several reasons. They had an unyielding determination to fight, with that pride that they had in preserving their way of life. That went for a lot, even though they lacked things such as numbers of soldiers and resources that the North had. If you look on the screen, you can see the map of the country as it existed in 1860. The northern states of the Union are represented here in blue. The Confederate states, the South, are represented in gray. The 4 states that you see in red are considered the border states. These were states that were unsure of whether or not they needed to secede with the rest of the South. They were slave-owning states. President Lincoln, when he was inaugurated and began his presidency, was very concerned about keeping these border states in the Union. These states ended up not seceding and stuck with the Union for the remainder of the war. 1860 saw the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln and also the first gunfire of the Civil War at Fort Sumter, which we discussed today. This was a northern or Union-controlled fort located off the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The Southerners began opening fire on the fort when Northern supply ships were sent down to stock more provisions. The Southerners saw this as a sign of aggression and opened fire on the fort and forced the major inside from the Union, Major Anderson, to surrender. Therefore, the South considered this a victory. We also looked at the leaders of both armies today in class. General Robert E. Lee of the South, who was one of the most decorated and respected generals of his day. He was the entire South's main hope for the war, and he served as general from the very beginnings in 1861 till the very bitter end in 1865. General Grant, on the other hand, did not serve as the chief commanding officer of Union forces until 1864. However, he was involved in the fighting of the Civil War from the very beginning. Both of these men had known each other from previous battles and also their experience together at West Point Military Academy. We also looked at Abraham Lincoln himself, who was our 16th president, and his election and inauguration is what prompted the South to secede. Let's review again some of the issues leading up to the Civil War, and one of the biggest ones was, of course, slavery. Let's take a look at this treatment of slaves and why this was such a big issue. If you look at this first statement here, it says the Civil War began not because of slavery, but because states thought that their rights were being taken away. Because slavery had ended in the North after the American Revolution, slaves were still needed to work on the farms and plantations in the South. So this goes hand in hand with the issue of states' rights that we've also discussed in class. Slaves were often on rich plantations, not on the smaller farms that were owned by most of the Southerners. Congress made it illegal to import slaves from Africa in 1808. Both the North and South had free African Americans, especially in cities, where there were more chances of finding work. However, life for free African Americans was difficult. In the South, it was required that they carry certificates of freedom. The African Americans were faced with prejudicial treatment in the North as they were in the South. They were not allowed in hotels and restaurants, and they were forced to sit in separate sections in white churches. Many slaves were mistreated by the slave owners. Some slaves were beaten or even hanged for trying to escape. So as you can see, slavery caused a lot of issues, mostly social issues as far as their treatment and how they were viewed by whites both in the North and the South. Even though the Civil War ended in 1865, the struggle for equality for African Americans would continue and still continues to this day. Now let's look at the soldiers that fought in the U.S. Civil War. They're divided into 3 main groups, as you can see: infantry, artillery, and cavalry. Let's take a look at some of the features of each group. The infantry soldiers, as you can see pictured here, had some of the most challenging jobs of any soldiers. These were the foot soldiers who had to fight in the worst conditions. In the South, many of these foot soldiers faced a lack of supplies and resources, in which they had to make use of basically anything they could find. Many men were drafted into both armies, and most of them were young men ages 15 to 18. Now let's look at the artillery. You can see artillery is considered heavy machinery, weaponry that's used in the Civil War. Soldiers that manned these cannons and other large weapons were considered artillery soldiers. They were obviously working hand in hand with the infantry soldiers, but they were farther removed from the battlefield itself. Finally, the cavalry soldiers were soldiers that were mounted on horseback, as you can see in these photographs and illustrations. These soldiers, as you can see in the description here, were involved with raids and other scouting exercises. They were armed with several weapons, including handguns and sabers even, which are forms of swords. These would ride for long distances and try to gather information on the enemy. Here you can see the common flags that were carried by both the Union and Confederacy throughout the Civil War. This here is obviously the rebel flag that was carried by the Confederate soldiers, and this was the Union flag. The flag as we know today, and the Union carries, had different amounts of stars, depending on the number of states that were in the Union at the time. Now let's briefly review the main battle for 1861, which occurred shortly after the shelling at Fort Sumter, which was in April. This battle took place in July of 1861. At this point, the war was on full scale. The South had seceded. Abraham Lincoln was the president, much to the chagrin of the South, which is why they seceded. And so this battle took place at a town that was very much in the northern part of Virginia, almost to the border of Maryland. So it was on the border of the North and the South. And in this battle, the South proved its tenacity and its determination because even though they were outnumbered, they were able to hold on with the help of people like Stonewall Jackson. The North got tired and were pushed back and forced to retreat. If you look at page 169 of your blue textbook, you can see at the top a graph which shows that the North definitely had advantages when it came to population, industrial workers, and amounts of supplies. Their naval ship tonnage, iron production, and firearms production definitely outnumbered the South. So even though the North had these advantages and their strategies were basically to cut off the South's railroad lines, you can also see on page 169 that the North had a much better navy, which could blockade southern ports so that the South wouldn't be able to get supplies that it needed or food. The Union's riverboats and armies could also move down the Mississippi River and try to split the Confederacy in two. The North definitely had these objectives and strategies outlined at the beginning of the war, but the fact of the Southern determination and pride is what kept them from achieving those objectives in the first 2 years of battle. The Confederacy, on the other hand, were basically just trying to fight a defensive war. They were fighting in their home territory, and they had great military leadership, knowledge of the land, and that pride that we've discussed. This is what enabled them to hold off the North in the first 2 years of fighting. However, as time went on, it became more difficult for the South to combat the North's strengths in industrial output and resources and men as the war continued to go on. I want to introduce a concept that I want you guys to learn very well about the Civil War, and it was what the North called the Anaconda Plan. If you look on page 169, along with these strategies that I've just discussed, you can see pretty much what the Anaconda Plan was. The idea of blockading southern ports and cutting the Confederacy in half is what the Anaconda Plan involved. And an anaconda is a large snake that constricts its victims to the point where they suffocate. That's basically what the North was trying to do to the South at the beginning of the war, which was evident in this first battle at Bull Run, because as you can see, they were trying to capture Virginia railroad lines. This Anaconda Plan was in use both on land and in the water, since the North had a navy. It was the idea of constricting the South and forcing them to lose resources and other supplies that were needed, food, whatever it may be, that the South could use to continue their war efforts. This Anaconda Plan would hopefully allow the North to win as soon as possible by cutting off the South's access to supplies. We also looked briefly at the main battle for the year 1862, which was the Battle of Antietam. If you look on your book on page 171 at the bottom, you can see a map. And the zoomed in map that says Battles of the East, you can see where Antietam is. It is again on the border of Virginia and Maryland. So it's one of those locations that was close to the North. At this point, the South had been on such a roll with their confidence and their passion for fighting that generally felt like he could use this battle as a springboard to invade the North. So you can see that detailed here where it says the South strategy. Then they could hopefully defeat the North in their own territory and cause the North to give up, which would give peace and independence to the Confederacy. The North did win this battle, but it was not in the way that they were hoping to. It took much longer than it should have, given the fact that the North outnumbered the South by a big margin, and that they had found a copy of Lee's orders. General McClellan which was the Northern general at this battle, was fired by Lincoln shortly after because instead of pursuing the South once this battle was over, he did not and allowed the South to retreat back to their home territory and regroup. This is why Lincoln fired him after the Battle of Antietam. Shortly after the Battle of Antietam, which the North technically won, President Lincoln decided to broaden the focus of the Civil War. Up to this point, Lincoln's main objective, which I've mentioned in class, was to preserve the Union. He tried to encourage the South to not secede when he was elected by telling them that they could keep their slaves in the southern states. They just could not expand slavery into the new western territories. The South didn't believe him and they seceded. After the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln started to realize that if he broadened the scope of the war, possibly it could make the South lose quicker. So he drafted up something called the Emancipation Proclamation, which you can see on your screen. It went into effect on January 1st of 1863, but he drafted it shortly after the Battle of Antietam, which was in September of 1862. Basically, what the Emancipation Proclamation said was that slaves that were in the rebellious states of the Confederacy would be free. It did not free slaves in the border states or in any of the Union states, which there was some slavery up in those states. So the question is, why did he limit the amount of slaves that would be included with this proclamation? We know that he was against slavery, but his number one goal was to preserve the Union. He did not want to offend those border states that had remained loyal to the Union. So this was a way to sort of compensate them, but still hurt the South at the same time. This proclamation encouraged many African Americans to make their way to the northern states. They had to take that perilous journey themselves through the southern states and make it to the north. But once they got there, they were allowed to serve in the Union Army. I want to focus your attention right here on this paragraph, which says, from the first days of the Civil War, slaves had acted to secure their own liberty. The Emancipation Proclamation confirmed their insistence that the war for the Union must become a war for freedom. It added moral force to the Union cause and strengthened the Union both militarily and politically. As a milestone along the road to slavery's final destruction, the Emancipation Proclamation has assumed a place among the great documents of human freedom. So while it did not free all the slaves, it was a start. And the slaves were finally set free completely at the end of the Civil War with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. So 1863 started with a new focus and a fresh emphasis on the Civil War by Lincoln issuing his Emancipation Proclamation. However, it's the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 that was considered the turning point of the war. You can see some details of this battle on your screen. It occurred July 1st through 3rd of 1863, and what Lee was trying to do here was to regroup from the loss at Antietam and try once again to invade the northern states. He tried to do this at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. You can see some description of what the Confederate forces were facing at the beginnings of this battle. This is what happened on the first day of fighting. Feel free to pause your screen and read the box in orange. The fighting continued the second day, July 2nd, and you can again see what took place on that day in the orange box. So feel free to pause the recording. Finally, day 3 of the Gettysburg battle ended with a final assault, a last-ditch effort by the Southern troops in what became known as Pickett's Charge, which is when the Southern forces under General George Pickett tried one last time to take the main part of the battlefield called Cemetery Ridge. This was not successful, and many of the Southerners in this charge died. Ultimately, the North won this battle. Here's another breakdown of the Battle of Gettysburg, so I would encourage you to read through the slide or print it out so you can have it in your notes. The Battle of Gettysburg is considered the turning point because the day after, July 4th, there was another major battle in the South in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was very far away from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The combination of these two victories for the North is what ended up becoming the turning point of the Civil War, where at this point the North began to win most of the major battles. The South just simply could not keep up with the ability of the North to produce more resources, clothing, weaponry, food, and the South was continuing to unravel because it could not match the Northern strength in these categories. So from here on out, the North is on a roll. The South starts to come apart, even though it had that passion and determination for fighting. They could not match the North's resources. The North would now begin to use a total war approach to bring final victory to the Union forces.